My name is Nebo, son of a weaver, born in the shadows of the great walls of Babylon. I lived my life like any other common man in our grand city. I was not a warrior, nor a noble, just a plebeian, walking through the crowded streets, feeling the scorching heat of the Babylonian sun while performing the simple tasks of daily life. But what I witnessed during the fall of our city would forever change the way I understood the world of the living. That morning, the city seemed as alive as ever. Merchants sold their wares in the market, the air filled with the scent of spices and incense. I was walking towards the Isagila temple, where Marduk, the Almighty, reigned supreme, or so we believed. The hot wind subtly blew through the stone streets, and I felt an unease, a growing discomfort, as if the very air was heavy with dark omens. The rumors were inescapable. Cyrus the Great's army was near. The walls whispered stories of betrayal, of gates that would open from within. But no one believed that a city like Babylon, protected by Marduk, would fall so easily. No one except me. Something haunted me deeply, an invisible shadow I could not shake. Something was wrong with the world. Something was wrong with the gods. I continued my way to the market, trying to stifle these anxieties, but the unease grew like a weight in my chest. When I reached the main square, things began to change. The clouds that once merely hovered became thick, and the sky took on a bronze hue, as if the sun had been smothered by the gods. The people around me continued their lives, seemingly blind to what was happening. It was then that I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The sound of the walls breaking echoed throughout the city like distant thunder. Cyrus was here. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air, and panic spread like a plague. The streets, once full of life, were now filled with people running in all directions, seeking a safe place. But there was no safety. I ran towards the Isagila temple, not out of faith, but because I felt something deeper was happening. When I arrived at the temple, the air was thick, almost tangible. The statues of gold and stone seemed distorted, and then I saw him, Marduk, not as a statue, but as a living presence, hovering above the temple, shrouded in shadows and golden light. He wasn't there to protect us. The face that had once been revered was now twisted in pure rage. The prayers that had echoed in my mind since childhood turned into empty hums. He was furious with us, his worshippers, but not because we had failed him. No, he was furious because we had forgotten what we truly were. Tools, nothing more than disposable pieces in a divine game. The ground began to open up around me, not with fire or destruction, but with a dark veil. The shadows rose from the cracks, dancing and taking shape, and it was then that I realized that true horror. Marduk wasn't just judging, he was sealing a curse over the city. In my mind, an ancient voice, cold as death, whispered, "You who have failed, who did not protect what was given to you, shall be the ghosts of the city, cursed to walk eternally through the ruins. Your souls will never rest. Your names will be erased from history as if you never existed." Then something unexpected happened. My skin began to burn, but it wasn't the usual heat of Babylon. It was as if some ancient energy was being poured into me, rooting itself inside my body. I looked at my hands and saw, horrified, that small marks began to appear, etched directly into my skin, symbols I couldn't recognize. They seemed to move, writhing like living serpents. I felt intense pain. It was as if something was trying to take control, as if I was being devoured from the inside out. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my hands touching the stone floor. The marks spread, crawling up my arms and chest. I tried to fight it, but it was useless. The energy filling me was not of life, but something much darker. I was being transformed, doomed to become an extension of Marduk's curse. Around me, the temple descended into chaos. The shadows that had emerged from the cracks now formed figures, grotesque and distorted, wandering through the temple, each marked with the same symbols now engraved on my skin. The statues of lesser gods split in half, as if something invisible was tearing them apart from within. I knew then what was happening. Marduk was trapping our souls, our lives, within ourselves. He would turn us into living shadows, condemned to wander the ruins forever, never finding peace, never escaping the cycle of suffering. In despair, I dragged myself to the temple entrance. I needed to leave to flee from this evil energy before it completely overtook me. But when I looked outside, the city was no longer the Babylon I knew. The streets were covered in a thick, almost supernatural fog, and indistinct shapes moved within it. Other citizens, condemned like me, deformed by the curse. I was no longer in Babylon. I was in a land between worlds, a place where time and space made no sense. What had started as a mere mortal conquest had now become a divine plan of destruction and eternal suffering. Cyrus the Great was just the instrument. The real power came from Marduk, and his wrath would now fall upon all of us. But there was something more. A deep sound, a rhythmic thumping that I could not ignore, came from the heart of the city. At first, I thought it was war drums, but then I realized the truth. They were heartbeats. The very city of Babylon was alive, pulsing with Marduk's dark energy. Each beat made the ground tremble, and I could feel the world around me unraveling, as if the city was about to collapse in on itself. With the last strength I had, I ran through the fog-covered streets, trying to escape this cycle of pain. But the city's heartbeats intensified, getting closer, louder, and I knew my time was running out. There was no escape. Marduk had sealed me in a fate of eternal suffering, along with all the others. Then I realized, we were not just victims, we were the sacrifice. The sacrifice so that the glory of Babylon would never be forgotten, but that we, its souls, would never rest. Each beat of the city's heart would echo for eternity, and our souls would continue to wander, trapped between this world and the next, never knowing peace, only the eternal reminder of a city that devoured us. And so, as I feel the shadows closing in on me, I hear the heartbeats getting louder, stronger, closer. I know what is coming. Soon, I too will join the pulse of the city, forever lost in the cursed ruins of Babylon.
I remember the smell of freshly baked bread that morning, wafting from the bakery. The warm air was still pleasant, and the sound of the marketplace was beginning to come alive, with a murmur of familiar voices filling the streets of Pompeii. I was selling spices. I had just opened my small shop on Via del Abbondanza, one of the busiest streets in the city. Birds chirped around the temple of Apollo, and horses clattered their hooves on the worn stones, restless as their owners haggled over fresh fruit and goods. Everything seemed normal, but the animals, something about them was wrong. The dogs were restless, pacing in circles and barking at nothing. I saw some of them howling, as if sensing something terrible in the air. On the horizon, beyond the temples and marble statues, Mount Vesuvius stood still, silent as ever, but a thin plume of smoke began to rise slowly from the crater. No one paid attention. Vesuvius, our old neighbor, was a sleeping guardian, and we Pompeians never truly worry about him. But shortly after midday, the air began to change. Something suffocating and dense hung over the streets. I first felt a chill crawl up my spine, a feeling I couldn't explain. Then, there was a roar, like the sound of 1,000 thunderstorms at once, but distant, deep. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The noise grew louder, reverberating between the buildings and echoing through the hills. I ran to the main square, the confusion rising around me. The Forum, which minutes before was a center of trade and life, turned into a place of confusion and fear. People began spilling out of their homes, looking up at the sky. Vesuvius, the giant, had finally awoken. The sky, once blue, began to darken. Ash started to fall like a storm. I looked around and saw nothing but terrified faces, all with the same question in their eyes. What was happening? Within minutes, chaos erupted. Some screamed for us to flee to the port. Others clung to their statues of gods and goddesses, as if begging for divine protection. I started running. My feet pounded against the hot stones as the ground continued to shake violently. Bodies piled up in the narrow streets as everyone tried to escape at once, hitting each other in desperation. I remembered my wife, Lucilla, and our children. They were home far from the market, but I couldn't turn back. The way was blocked by the desperate crowd. I saw faces I knew, friends who shopped at my store, other merchants. One of them, Marco, a fabric seller, was trampled in front of me as he tried to get up. I wanted to help him, but I was pushed forward by the frantic mass. Screams and cries filled the air. Vesuvius kept roaring, now louder and closer, as if hell itself was opening. The ash was falling thicker. My eyes burned, my throat felt like it was on fire. The heat was unbearable, and the stench of sulfur and death mixed with the smell of burning bodies. Houses crumbled around us. The city was dissolving under the weight of destruction. The horses, once elegantly pulling carriages, had gone mad. They charged through the streets, knocking down anyone in their way, their eyes wild with panic. Birds fell from the sky, suffocated by the smoke. Dogs howled in agony, their fur covered in scorching ash. Could hear the crackling of fires starting to consume the city. I desperately tried to find shelter, but there was nowhere safe. Stones rained from the sky, large and heavy, smashing roofs and skulls alike. I ran toward the Temple of Jupiter, a grand structure that had once seemed untouchable in the center of the square. Thought the gods might protect me there, but even the temple began to crumble, its giant columns collapsing like toys before the fury of the mountain. I found a small group of people huddled in a corner, trying to shield themselves from the heat. Their eyes were empty, as if they had already accepted the end. But I couldn't. I couldn't just wait for death. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept running. I didn't know where to go, I just ran. Every step was harder than the last. The ash covered me like a shroud of death, suffocating, weighing me down. Finally, my strength left me, fell to my knees on the rough, hot ground, and it was then that I realized there was no escape. The sky was as dark as night, though it was still afternoon, and on the horizon, the wave of fire and molten rock was descending quickly, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't stand anymore. All I could do was look around one last time, my vision blurred by smoke and pain. Pompeii, my home, my life, was disappearing, sinking beneath an eternal shroud of ash. Everything I had ever known and loved was being destroyed before my eyes. The last thing I felt was the suffocating heat enveloping me, and everything went dark like a candle blown out by a cruel wind.
I was born under the relentless heat of a month's sun, a daughter of noble lineage, blessed by the gods. My days flowed smoothly like the serene course of the Nile. My father was one of Pharaoh Akhenaten's advisors, and our house, standing proudly by the river's edge in Amarna, was filled with the finest luxuries. Life as I knew it was one of splendor and devotion to the one God, Aten, as the Pharaoh decreed. But what I experienced, no one should ever know. My chambers were adorned with fine linen and gold, jars of wine, and perfumes of myrrh. Around me, the sounds of women serving and the laughter from the markets filled the air. The great temple of Aten, with its columns reaching toward the sky, stood nearby, and from it, I could hear the murmured prayers of the priests. However, amidst this magnificence, something dark lurked in the corners of my life. Always by my side was Tefnet, a slave who had grown up with me since we were children. He had been a gift from my mother when I turned 12, destined to serve me for life. Though he was ever present, I never truly saw him as an equal. He was obedient, submissive, yet there was always something in his eyes, something I never fully understood. But I ignored it, of course. How could I not? I was of noble blood, surrounded by everything that ancient Egypt could offer. But in the last few months, Tefnut's behavior began to change. His movements became erratic, as though he was fleeing from something invisible. He whispered in the shadows, speaking words I couldn't comprehend, with a voice that was strange and filled with anguish. What began with furtive glances turned into pleas, in which he repeated that something had been awakened. "Mistress," he would say, his eyes deep with fear, "something has risen in the temple, something we cannot see." I dismissed him. I sent him away from my chambers many times, thinking he had been seized by some fever. After all, he was just a slave, and slaves were known to have their minds tormented by the miserable lives they led. But then, one night, he disappeared. I searched the entire house, commanding the other servants to find him, but Tefnut was nowhere to be found. And then, the silence of the night was shattered by screams from the great market of Amarna. I rushed out to the balcony of my chambers and saw chaos unfolding among the stalls of fruit and grain, flickering in the torchlight. In the center of the tumult, a shadow seemed to move with an imposing yet indistinct presence. The people screamed, their faces twisted in terror, as this entity, a dark, amorphous mass, cloaked in thick darkness, pursued them. Something inside me broke. Somehow, I knew Tefnut was involved. I was seized by a strange courage and descended into the market, disregarding the conventions of a noble woman. When I arrived, the chaos had subsided, but the air felt dense, almost tangible. A smell of iron and decay lingered, suffocating. And then, I saw him. Tefnut stood in the center of the square, his clothes tattered and stained with blood. His eyes were dull, vacant, and his lips moved in silent prayers. He did not recognize me, and his hands, blackened, clutched something that gleamed in the moonlight. An amulet. It was golden, etched with symbols I did not recognize. "He has chosen me," Tefnut whispered, never looking directly at me. "The ancient god, not the one you worship. The forgotten god. The one who has always been here, beneath the sands, waiting." I tried to approach him, but something in the air stopped me. An invisible pressure weighed on my chest. I could feel a presence around me, something beyond this world. The shadows moved as if they were alive, swarming around Tefnut. I wanted to scream, but fear froze me. He then looked directly at me, and for a brief moment, it was as if he was no longer human. The weeks that followed were filled with terror. Tefnut never returned to the house, and as the days passed, more and more people in Amarna began to disappear. They said ancient spirits had been awakened, that something had been unearthed in the temples. On the quietest nights, I could hear the winds whispering through the halls of my house, calling Tefnut's name. One night, I awoke to the sound of something scratching at the door of my chambers. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but constant. I rose slowly, my heart racing, and when I opened the door, there was nothing there. Nothing but an amulet, the same as the one Tefnut had held in the market. I placed it on my table and turned away, but the air around me seemed to vibrate as if something was standing right beside me, unseen yet present. Since that night, darkness has become my constant companion. The amulet remains in my room, and no matter how many times I try to rid myself of it, it always returns. My dreams are filled with shadows, and a voice whispers endlessly, promising that the entity will return for me. Now, when I look into the bronze mirror in my room, sometimes I see a reflection that is not my own. I see Tefnet's vacant eyes and a shadow behind me, growing ever closer. I am a daughter of nobles, blessed by the gods, but no wealth or status can save me now. Something was awakened, something ancient and forgotten, and now it haunts me, just as it haunted Tefnet. And I fear that very soon, the darkness will finally come to claim its last prey.